Lesson 19, to declare or not to declare. Well, there's a big argument among VBA programmers about whether or not we should declare our variables. The people who are in favor of declaring variables says, hey, it takes up less space in memory, helps you avoid spelling errors, allows the IntelliSense to work, forces you to plan ahead, and your variables will have a longer scope. The problems with that is one of the pros. It forces you to plan ahead. I love not declaring my variables. I love to be able to just create a variable on the fly and create variables as I go. It's my favorite way of programming. I don't want to have to think about the whole program. I think about the program in chunks. I need to do this, then I need to do this, then I need to do this. And when I get to that third part, I may need a new variable that I wasn't thinking about to begin with. So I don't want to declare my variables. Okay, so let's get started. I have a workbook here. Let's jump over to Visual Basic. And I want to create a new macro, sub test macro. And if I want a variable, it's easy. I just say, this row equals ActiveCell.row. And I'm good to go. I have created my own little variable on the fly. Okay, now, the people who want to declare their variables, I say, look, when you choose this row, it's going to be declared as a variant, and variants take up the most space possible in memory. This is going to use, let's say 16 bytes, whereas if you declared it as a long, it would take up only 8 bytes. And I think that explanation is ridiculous at this point. I could see back in the days when we had machines that had 64K of memory, we would care whether it was 4 bytes or 8 bytes, but now, it's ridiculous. Our machines have 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory. It cannot possibly matter whether we store this in 16 bytes or in 4 bytes or in 8 bytes. So I'm just not a fan of declaring my variables just because of the memory savings. One thing that is nice about declaring your variables is later on, if I would type something like this row and go to a new line, notice that it changed the capitalization of this row in every line in this particular macro. And I do appreciate the fact that if I had declared the variable up front, and here's how we declare it. We say dim, stands for dimension, this row as long. Well, now I don't have to type it in that certain case. I can just say this row equals 5. And when I go to a new line, it will capitalize everything for me. And a great thing to follow as you're writing VBA, especially as you're typing, is to type everything in lowercase. And then when you go to a new line, you should see everything get capitalized. So ActiveCell.row. If I had typed something wrong, nothing gets capitalized in that case. And it's a good alert that you just had a typo and you want to fix it. So I do nominally accept that declaring your variables helps catch spelling errors and makes it a little bit easier because you don't have to capitalize everything. Of course, I do declare my object variables because that allows the IntelliSense to work. It really then comes down to, well, do you want to have to plan your whole macro out? Back in school when we were in a programming class, they wanted us to flowchart the whole program before we started. Hey, this is, lots of times this is just quick and dirty coding, and we just want to be able to knock out a few lines of code. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of declaring variables. Okay, now if you're a person who really wants to declare all of your variables, you could come up here before the first macro and say option explicit. With option explicit, you're basically going to force Excel to make you declare your variables. If you would create a new variable on the fly and then either try and compile, it's going to stop and say, hey, that variable is not defined. You have not defined it. So if you're a fan of declaring your variables, by all means, feel free to use option explicit. Now, one of the time when we absolutely have to declare our variables is when we want to control what's called the scope of the variable. I have a second module here. This module has a couple of different macros, macro A and macro B. And macro A calls macro B. So the way that this will work is we have a few lines of code here, one line of code, and then we say, hey, go run everything in macro B. Well, let's just step through here. Press F8, and in the immediate pane, we can see that print this row is equal to 1. But when I start to run macro B, and now I'm down here in macro B, I want to find out what this row is. Unfortunately, it's a different macro, so it has no clue what this row is, because this row has not been defined here in macro B. Well, there's a solution to this, and that's called setting up the scope. And the way that we do that is, again, we come to the top of the macro, and we say dim this row as long. All right, and now that that's up there, watch what happens when I start to run macro A. So this row is now equal to 1. Beautiful. We're down in macro B now, and even down here in macro B, it knows what this row is. You are in row 1. So by setting up that dim, every procedure in this module, so in module scope, will understand what the this row variable is. Now, if you needed to call a procedure in another module, so for example, if I needed to call something back in mod dim, our test macro, well, then instead of using dim up here, we want to change that word to public. Public is basically like setting up a large scope that will be available to every single module in this workbook. All right, so by using this now, it works when we're down in macro B. It'll also work if we ran test macro, which is over in the other module. So let's try that. And here we have to not redimension that variable. Try it again. So here, press F8 a few times, we get over to test macro, and it still knows what that variable is from the other module. So a couple of different things there. Dim inside of a module is really optional. It will help with nominally with memory. It'll help with spelling errors. The place where you're really forced to dimension your variables is here, where you need the variable to live and still be recognized down in your next macro. And then we'll come up and use the dim outside of the first macro to create a module level scope. If you need that to extend to all of the modules in the workbook, then we use public instead of dim. A great way to go. Well, that's the end of this part. I hope you found this lesson useful, and thanks for watching.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than Live Lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.